In one 1976 film, a knight in full plate armor breaks into a woman's bathhouse. It sounds like a standard adventure setup, doesn't it? But instead of a sword fight, the camera lingers for 5 agonizing minutes. The hero just stands there, watching as actresses, wearing little more than strips of wet cloth, try to mimic medieval daily life. This wasn't a director's mistake. It was a business model. The industry had a simple pact. If your historical script was stalling, you didn't need better dialogue. You just needed more skin to save the budget. Critics called these films masquerading brothels, while producers branded them the new raw realism. Tonight, we're digging into the forbidden archive of medieval exploitation, the films that mainstream critics didn't want you to see, and that have been buried under layers of historical respectability for decades. If you thought you knew what knightly cinema looked like, forget it. We're going to show you exactly how these movies were sold, without the censorship and without the lies. Number 10. Flavia the Heretic, 1974, directed by Franco. To close our archive, we have Flavia the Heretic, perhaps the most visually striking and brutally honest example of how the Nunsploitation subgenre weaponized medieval religious history. Set against the backdrop of the intense conflict between the church and the rising influence of the Islamic world, the film follows a young noblewoman, Flavia, who is forced into a convent by her father. What follows is not a spiritual journey, but a violent, visceral rebellion against the crushing patriarchy of the medieval church. The film uses the monastery setting as a pressure cooker, where religious repression, sexual frustration, and historical fanaticism collide in a series of disturbing, uncompromising sequences. Unlike the cheaper, more trashy entries in this genre, Flavia the Heretic carries a sense of genuine, albeit twisted, narrative ambition. It doesn't just objectify its characters for the sake of a quick shock. It frames their suffering as a direct consequence of a society built on the systematic subjugation of women. However, it remains a pillar of the exploitation canon precisely because it revels in the depiction of torture, humiliation, and blasphemy. It leans into every trope the audience expected: the dungeons, the masks, the public whippings, and the nuns behaving badly spectacle. But it wraps these elements in a layer of social-political commentary that makes the viewer feel both voyeuristic and intellectually challenged. It belongs in our archive because it represents the moment where the genre tried to justify its existence as serious political art, while still delivering the raw, visceral medieval exploitation that the drive-in crowds were actually lining up to see. It is the perfect, grimy coda to our journey, a film that proves the Middle Ages were a convenient, effective, and deeply cynical stage for the filmmaker's most perverse and provocative ideas. Number 9. Mark of the Devil, 1970. If A Bell from Hell is psychological, Mark of the Devil is the blunt force trauma of the genre. Set during the height of the witch hunts in the 18th century, though visually and tonally it is pure, dark Middle Ages, this film became infamous for its marketing campaign. Producers famously handed out vomit bags at theater screenings to prove how authentic and brutal their depiction of the Inquisition was. But behind the marketing stunt lies a deeply cynical exploitation of religious terror. The film focuses on a witch hunter and his young apprentice as they move from village to village, essentially running a racketeering operation where they torture innocent people for coin. The film lingers on the instruments of torture with a fascination that borders on the fetishistic. It isn't trying to show you the tragedy of the era. It's trying to show you the physics of pain. It exploits the audience's morbid curiosity about how much a human body can take. Every scene in the dungeon is lit and composed to maximize the exposure of the victims. It strips away the heroic myth of the knight and replaces it with the cold, calculated cruelty of the executioner. It's essential viewing for this list because it represents the ultimate failure of the genre. It claims to be a serious historical examination of the Inquisition, but it's really just a carnival of cruelty designed to sell tickets on the back of shock value and gratuitous suffering. Number 8. The Warlord, 1965. At first glance, The Warlord looks like a high-budget, respectable historical drama, the kind that studios made to win awards. Charlton Heston plays a Norman duke tasked with building a castle in a hostile pagan village. But underneath the prestige veneer, the film hides a deep, uncomfortable obsession with the right of the first knight. This is where the exploitation element creeps in. The film centers almost entirely on the Duke's possessive, almost predatory desire for a local bride, and the camera treats her body not as a character, but as a prize to be won, displayed, and dominated. For an audience in the 60s, this wasn't just history. It was a sanctioned way to watch a woman being systematically stripped of her agency under the guise of an authentic feudal ritual. What makes this film fascinating for our list is that it's not trash in the traditional sense, it's actually well directed and beautifully shot. But that quality is exactly what makes it so insidious. It takes the gross, exploitative power dynamics of the era and dresses them up in such high-quality cinematography that the audience feels smart for watching it, while they are actually just consuming high-end objectification. It's the perfect example of how serious cinema can be just as predatory as the cheapest Grindhouse flick. It just has a better budget for costumes and lighting. Number 7. The Virgin Spring, Jungfruschellen, 1960. Including an Ingmar Bergman film on an exploitation list might sound like heresy, but stay with me. The Virgin Spring is the original sin of the medieval subgenre. It tells a story of a father who exacts brutal revenge on the men who raped and murdered his daughter. While it's technically a masterpiece of world cinema, it also effectively created the rape revenge template that every low-budget exploiter would spend the next 20 years ripping off. The film contains a graphic, harrowing sequence of the assault that was so shocking for its time that it was actually heavily censored in many countries. This scene became the holy grail for every sleazy producer in the 70s. When you look at the lower-tier medieval films we are covering in this video, you realize they are all just pale, shallow imitations of the Virgin Spring. They stripped away Bergman's philosophy, his moral questioning, and his humanity, leaving behind only the violence and the voyeurism. The reason this film belongs on our list is simple. It's the high watermark that unintentionally turned the medieval assault into a trope. Every director we're covering in this series was trying to chase the visceral, controversial impact that Bergman achieved here. But where he found tragedy, they only ever found a way to sell tickets. It's the origin point of the gaze we're examining, the moment the medieval setting officially became a stage for the exploitation of suffering. Number 6. The Saragossa Manuscript, Rencapis nell'Esionu vi Saragosse, 1965. This film is a labyrinthine, psychedelic journey through a medieval-adjacent landscape, weaving together tales of occultism, ghostly encounters, and surreal encounters. Unlike the straightforward Nunsploitation or witch hunt films that define the lower end of the genre, the Saragossa Manuscript operates on a level of intellectual pretension that makes its exploitative undercurrents even more bizarre. The story follows a young officer who wanders through a haunted region of Spain, encountering seductive princesses and shadowy cabals. For the average 70s audience, the plot was essentially incomprehensible. But that wasn't why people were packing the theaters. The film is an endurance test of hypnotic imagery, where the medieval setting is used as a chaotic playground for dream logic. It constantly presents women in compromising, fairy tale states of dress, not for the sake of a narrative, but as a visual hook to maintain attention amidst the dense philosophical dialogue. It manages to feel like a serious historical epic while simultaneously functioning as a vehicle for the same kind of visual indulgence seen in drive-in grindhouse flicks. The brilliance of this film is its ability to hide in plain sight. Because it is so structurally complex and artistically ambitious, it rarely gets slagged as trash. Yet when you strip away the narrative layers, you are left with a work that is fundamentally concerned with the visual consumption of the female form within an exoticized ancient past. It represents the highbrow version of the exploitation we are cataloging, showing just how pervasive these tropes were, even in the most celebrated and respected international cinema of the era. Number 5. Witchfinder General, 1968. Directed by Michael Reeves, Witchfinder General, released as The Conqueror Worm in the US, is perhaps the most aggressive and unflinching look at the cruelty of the 17th century witch hunts ever put to film. Set against the backdrop of the English Civil War, it follows the real-life historical figure Matthew Hopkins, a man who traveled the countryside torturing and executing those accused of witchcraft for financial profit. While The Virgin Spring used the assault as a tragic pivot, Witchfinder General uses it as a constant, grinding reality of the world it depicts. The film is infamous for its bleak, nihilistic atmosphere that seems to permeate every frame, casting the entire medieval landscape as a place devoid of any divine justice or moral order. The exploitation here isn't just about the occasional scene of nudity, it's about the prolonged, systemic objectification of the victims. Every interrogation scene is framed with a voyeuristic precision, ensuring that the audience is never allowed to look away from the physical suffering of the accused. The marketing team knew exactly what they were doing when they pushed the realism angle. They weren't selling a history lesson, they were selling the voyeuristic thrill of witnessing the unwitnessable. It is a deeply uncomfortable experience precisely because it is so well made. It strips the crusader, or knight, of his armor and reveals the raw, ugly machinery of state-sanctioned violence. By the time the credits roll, the film has successfully convinced you that the Middle Ages were a time of utter hopelessness, a narrative choice that perfectly served the Grindhouse goal of leaving the audience feeling drained, shocked, and somehow dirty for having participated in the experience. It serves as a masterclass in how to weaponize historical misery for entertainment purposes. Number 4. The Devils, 1971. If you want to understand the true breaking point of the medieval exploitation genre, The Devils is the film that shattered the mold. Directed by Ken Russell, this is not just a movie, it is a full-blown assault on the senses. Set in 17th century France, it portrays a corrupt church, a sexually repressed nunnery, and the subsequent mass hysteria that follows. While other films in this list use medieval tropes as a background, The Devils uses them as a torture chamber for the audience. The imagery is drenched in Catholic symbolism, but it is twisted into something aggressively profane and intentionally offensive. It remains one of the few films from that era that genuinely terrified the religious establishment, leading to bans and heavy cuts worldwide, which of course only served to make it the most legendary forbidden film of its generation. What makes The Devils so vital to our archive is its sheer lack of restraint. It doesn't just show Nunsploitation, it turns the concept into a feverish, operatic nightmare. The production design by Derek Jarman is chillingly sterile, creating a stark, white, dungeon-like world that contrasts violently with the chaotic, hysterical behavior of the sisters. It strips away the heroic veneer of the era and leaves only the rotting core of power, desire, and ignorance. The film exploits the audience's deep-seated discomfort with religion, authority, and nudity simultaneously, refusing to let you find the moral high ground. It's a masterwork of cinematic provocation that makes the sleazier, low-budget entries on this list look like child's play. It forces you to watch the dismantling of human dignity, presented as a high art spectacle, and it's arguably the most honest reflection of how the medieval era was used as a playground for directors' inner demons. Number 3. The Bloody Judge, Il Trono di Fuoco, 1970. This film is the absolute quintessence of the masquerading brothel trope we identified in our hook. Starring Christopher Lee as the notorious Judge Jeffries, The Bloody Judge might look like a prestigious historical drama on the surface, but make no mistake, this is pure, unadulterated exploitation. Directed by Jess Franco, the master of European low-budget sleaze, the film takes the historical reality of the 17th century witch hunts and strips away any semblance of dignity, turning the entire ordeal into a parade of medieval sadism and voyeurism. The camera here doesn't act as an objective historian. It acts as a participant, lingering on torture devices and interrogation scenes with a disturbing, fetishistic level of detail. What makes this film essential for our archive is its sheer brazen hypocrisy. It hides behind the mask of a historical chronicle about the battle against witchcraft, but it spends its entire runtime and its limited budget recreating dark, damp dungeons where the victim's clothing seems to vanish at the first opportunity. Franco masterfully uses the contrast between the stately, imposing figure of Christopher Lee in his judge's robes and the grimy, grounded misery of the prison cells. For a 1970s audience, this was the perfect loophole. It provided a socially acceptable excuse to watch things on screen that would have been censored in any other context. The film exploits the classic trope of the helpless victim in the hands of a corrupt system, using the medieval setting as the only justification for showing prohibited imagery under the guise of documenting the Inquisition. It doesn't teach you a single thing about history. Instead, it invites you to indulge in its darkest and most forbidden facets. It is a textbook example of how the medieval era was used as a playground for directors' inner demons, proving once and for all that these films were never about the Middle Ages. They were about the exploitation of suffering. Number 2, The Hour of the Wolf, Bargtimmen, 1968. While The Virgin Spring is the original sin of the medieval exploitation genre, Ingmar Bergman's The Hour of the Wolf is its fever dream. Set in an isolated, windswept coastal environment that breathes the atmosphere of the Middle Ages, the film follows a painter retreating from the world, only to find themselves surrounded by a grotesque aristocratic cult that seems to have crawled out of a nightmare. This isn't a historical drama about knights or kings. It is a film about the disintegration of the psyche in a world that has forgotten the difference between reality and folklore. Bergman masterfully uses the medieval setting to strip away the comfort of the modern world, forcing the audience into a space where the grotesque and the beautiful are indistinguishable. The exploitation factor here is much more subtle and dangerous than in the Grindhouse slashers we've discussed. It is the exploitation of the viewer's own sanity. The film lingers on surreal, nightmarish imagery of masks, deformities, and impossible rituals that serve as the visual prototype for almost every occult medieval film that followed. It captures that specific medieval dread, a mixture of religious paranoia and rural isolation, and turns it into a visual feast of psychological cruelty. For an audience in the late 60s, this was a transformative experience. By abandoning traditional narrative structure, Bergman turned the medieval setting into a blank canvas for human depravity. It belongs on this list because it shows how even the most respected masters of world cinema were tapping into the same vein of dark, archaic imagery that the exploitation directors were trying to sell to the masses in the drive-ins. It is the sophisticated, intellectual ancestor of everything we've cataloged so far. Number 1. The Monk, Le Moine, 1972. Directed by Adonis Kairou. To cap off our archive, we have The Monk, a film that acts as the ultimate descent into the madness of the medieval mind. Based on the legendary Gothic novel by Matthew Lewis, it follows the story of Ambrosio, a pious and revered monk who falls from grace after being seduced by a demonic entity. Set against the backdrop of a grim, oppressive Spain, the film is a masterclass in the intersection of religious fanaticism and unbridled desire. It captures the very essence of the medieval nightmare. The idea that behind the monastery walls, the forces of hell are not just watching, but actively participating in the corruption of the soul. What makes The Monk the definitive finale for our list is its total commitment to the perverse beauty of its own depravity. Unlike the cheap, splatter-heavy exploitation films, this work is haunting, surreal, and deeply uncomfortably atmospheric. It doesn't just show you torture, it drags you through a labyrinth of black magic, pacts with the devil, and the slow, agonizing erosion of morality. It serves as the perfect final destination for our journey because it strips away the last pretense that these films were ever about history. Instead, it reveals what the genre was truly obsessed with all along: the terrifying, intoxicating realization that human nature, when trapped in the suffocating shadow of an ancient, dogma-heavy world, will always eventually break. It is the crowning jewel of our collection. A film that doesn't just ask you to look at the Middle Ages, but forces you to feel the rot from the inside out. And so we've traveled the full twisted path from the high art existential dread of Bergman's masterpieces to the unrelenting, sweat-stained grindhouse filth of Jess Franco's dungeons. If you look closely at any modern historical saga being released today, any prestige period drama or big-budget fantasy, you'll start to see the dose of these exact same tricks. The same exploitation of primal fear, the same voyeuristic obsession with degradation, and the same clever, cynical desire to package raw objectification under the dignified label of historical authenticity. These 1970s films weren't just a bizarre, isolated accident of the era, they were a mirror. They were the industry's most honest and most terrifying confession, revealing exactly what they have been selling us all along under the shiny, romanticized banner of the Age of Swords. The Forbidden Archive is officially closed for now, but the uncomfortable question lingers. Are we actually watching these films because we care about the history, or are we just as complicit as the filmmakers, drawn to the sight of someone suffering in the shadows of the past? It's a cycle that hasn't really ended, it's just evolved. I want to hear your take. Which of these films felt the most genuinely cynical to you? And do you think modern cinema is any different? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and make sure you're subscribed to the channel. We have plenty more buried, rotting stories in our vault that the mainstream industry would desperately prefer to keep hidden and forgotten. The next layer of the archive is waiting. See you there.